and thank you for listening to the History of World War II podcast, episode 282, interview with Peter Lyon about his book, Merg, the true story of one World War II soldier's selfless act of valor that one town never forgot. Peter Lyon is a 7-time Emmy Award-winning producer, director, and writer. His first book, American Saint Nick, is the true story of how a handful of American soldiers brought Christmas back to a small war-torn town during the darkest days of World War II. And today, we will discuss his follow-up success, Merg. Mr. Lyon, thank you very much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure to talk to you, Ray. This is something I've been looking forward to for quite some time. I
appreciate that. Now, before we jump into this, I just have to say, by the time I finished reading your book, and yes, there were some tears, I enjoyed the fact that it's a story about someone who was humble, who was giving, who was thinking about other people. And then you throw on the fact that he comes from a mega rich family, Hollywood good looks, can speak numerous languages. He has the best of everything. The world is literally on a silver platter for him. And yet he spends most of his time thinking about other people. It's this feel-good story right smack dab in the middle of World War II.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, let's extrapolate a little bit. It's almost like, you look at the times we live in now, and I sometimes wonder, would a George Mergenthaler, who you're talking about, does that person exist today? Right. And it's, I struggle with that because you're right. Here's a guy that, I always say had it all. I mean,
yes.
he had it all. And, could have done anything with his life. And, and as we see in the book, we know how his life played out, but it's just one of these incredible stories of just selflessness. And I think that's one of the things that really, as I started researching it, really kind of grabbed me. The more I got into it was that, again, this guy could have done anything. Even the basics where he could have been an officer.
Yes.
And he, his father, who had many connections in the government, because again, as you say, very wealthy family, heir to the Mergenthaler fortune, and we can talk a little about that in a moment, but his father could have pulled all these strings to get him, certainly a commission, if not, a cushy desk side job or whatever. And George, at 24 years old, didn't want that. He wanted to be just one of the regular guys and insisted on serving his time as his buck private, and that's what he was. But even the guys he served with in his unit, in the 28th Cavalry Reconnaissance Troop, knew that he should have been, an officer. In fact,
right.
His captain used to always look to him for advice because he was just one of those guys that, everybody knew he should have attained higher rank, but just insisted on being one of the guys. And you just got to admire that.
Yeah, I got the sense, I was like halfway through the book, and I got the sense that, his comrades are sitting next to him going, dude, what are you doing here? But he was so sincere that I think they could very quickly tell he wasn't playing a game. He was just trying to do his part.
Oh, absolutely. And, he, in doing his part, he was also trying to put some demons to rest too, because, his last name was Mergenthaler. He was some German descent. And of course, he still had relatives in Germany, distant relatives, but relatives in Germany during the war. Mm-hmm. So there was this internal battle that he waged, doing his part, but also like this guilty feeling of like, how could, his ancestral people do this and sort of, be at the whim of a madman kind of thing. And so he, and as I say in the book, his name sort of billboarded his heritage, and he kind of carried that guilt around with him in a way. So it was, there was a bit of an internal struggle for him, throughout his time in the war.
That makes sense. Yeah, kind of trying to undo kind of what Hitler was doing to the people that he came from. So if we could jump into this, how did you come across the story of George Mergenthaler?
Well, great question. It actually, I've known about this story for probably 20 years. Oh. And the way it came about was I had written a book called The American Saint Nick, also a true story, also set in World War II, also set in Luxembourg, which is where this story takes place. And I was talking with one of the main figures of that book, a man named Richard Brookins, who actually was the American Saint Nicholas.
Right.
And we were in Wiltz, Luxembourg, which is in the northern part of the country. And we were just chatting, and he said to me, "Did I ever tell you the story of George Mergenthaler?" And I said, "No." And he says, "Oh, well, do you want to know it?" I said, "Sure." Okay. He goes, "Well, come on, let's go." I was like, "What do you mean, let's go?" And he says, "Well, let's go to it." All right. So we jump into my rental car, and the town of Eschweiler, which is where basically the story of Merg takes place, is 4 miles away, just 4 miles north of Wiltz. So we're on our way to Eschweiler, and he says, "Okay, pull over." And there's a little roadside sign that points to this monument, and it says, Mergenthaler Memorial. Like, well, okay. And we go out and we look at this stone monument, and he starts telling me what he knows of the story, and I'm like, "Oh, this is really interesting. Wow, okay." Right. And he says, "Okay, come on, let's go to the church." And I'm like, "All right." So we drive, another mile up the road and go to the center of Eschweiler. Now, this is a very small town that you could easily drive right through and not even know you've been in it, except for the church, which sits at this elbow in the road. And it in itself is very unremarkable. It's, very austere, just, simple white walls, some stained glass windows, and a spire. And the interesting part about the spire is it rises from the back of the church over the altar versus over the sort of the organ where most spires, in the front of the church. So it's a little bit of odd architecture, but okay. So you see that and you're like, "Oh yeah, it's a white walls, black roof, big thick oak doors." You're like, "Okay, it's a lovely little church." And then you walk in, and Ray, I have to say, I was gobsmacked as soon as I walked through the door and saw the magnificent colors, the glow of these gorgeous stained glass windows. And as you walk in, the first thing that strikes you is you're in this glass vestibule, this glass enclosed vestibule, and there's a plaster relief on the wall of George Mergenthaler, and you get the sense, oh my gosh, now I understand the story, and you realize that this church is dedicated to this one soldier, and as far as we know, it's the only church in the world dedicated to a single American soldier. And I have to tell you, as I walked through the church and I saw, the stained glass windows that are dedicated to his family and to the U.S. Army and to Luxembourg, and then the mural behind the altar, which I won't give it away, but oh my gosh, that's what really hooked me in, and I'm like, this is a tremendous story. I have to know more about this, and that's really how it began. And so, again, that was like some 20 years ago, and at the time I was still in the midst of writing American Saint Nick, and I had finished that, and then it came to the promoting of that book and getting that word out there, and so that kind of all was happening. And Merg took a bit of a back seat, but then I revisited it, and I just once I started getting into the writing and research of the story, it just became more and more remarkable as I started writing it. And I say that, and I'm saying that not because I wrote the book, but I wrote the book because it was such a remarkable story.
It absolutely is, yeah. And like you, I'm getting the sense we're just excited to get to the end, because the very ending is, it's like you think the story's over, it's not. Then you think the story's over again, but it's not, so it goes on. But before we jump into that, could you give us, before we jump into George proper, could you give us an idea where he comes from, a little bit about his family, and so we can set up the story of George properly?
Oh, certainly. So, to understand the story of George Mergenthaler as told in Merg, you have to sort of go back in time, back through the mist of time, so to speak, and revisit his grandfather. And his grandfather was Otmar Mergenthaler. Now, some people might know that name. Most people probably don't. And what Otmar Mergenthaler was known for was his invention of the linotype machine. Now, the linotype was invented in the mid 1800s, 1874, 75, in that area. And prior to his invention, Otmar's invention of the linotype, there had not been an advance in the mass printing industry, and we mean like for newspapers and such, since the invention of the Gutenberg press. So we're talking 400 years
Right.
of people trying to like find a way to like get copy written and get it, published for newspapers. And if you think about it, back at the time, and like, we live in a much different age now with computers and, Instagram and all this kind of stuff. So it's a much different time. But back then, the sole primary way of communicating news, or anything for that matter, was newspapers. Right. So publishers were eager, were just trying desperately to find a way to mass print newspapers. At that time, there was no newspaper in the world that was more than 8 pages long, because they simply couldn't, go get the news, gather the news, typeset it, edit it, print it, and distribute it in a timely manner had it been any longer. I mean, like 8 pages was max. That's it. So, these publishers understood the power of the press, the power of newspaper and the power of communication, and they knew that if we could find a way to increase this both the time and the amount of news that we can get out there, it would be a win overall. Right. But there was nothing. There was just people had made attempts and they failed, and here comes Ottmar Mergenthaler, this immigrant from Germany. He was a bit of an idiot savant when it came to mechanics, because even as a young child he had he showed this tremendous prowess for all things mechanical, and one of the things that made him very unique was he had the ability to look at a piece of equipment, a machine, and just by looking at it and the parts involved, could tell you why it worked, why it didn't work, what could be better about it, if it could be improved upon, or if it was just, the design was nice, but it was never going to function properly. He just do it by looking at it, because he had this way of envisioning all the parts of the machine as a whole. So almost like if you've seen blueprints of machines, like from the patent office or whatever, he had a way of, in his head, being able to sort of break those all down and put them back together in his head. And it was pure genius in that respect. Right. And in fact, that was one of his first jobs when he came to this country. He was working for his half cousin at his half cousin's machine shop. And it became obvious this guy had this tremendous drafting ability. And at that time, the industrial age, the seat of invention for patenting was in Baltimore, it was right outside Washington. Right. So like anybody that had an idea for a machine had to get it patented. And in order to get it patented, you needed design drafts. And Ottmar had this incredible ability to, again, break down a machine and draw out the drafts for all these machines. And it was in that vein that this one guy comes up to him with this sort of typewriter machine that this guy James Celphane, had hoped would be the revolutionary machine to for the printing industry. Right. And Ottmar looked at it, and the guy left it with Ottmar for a few days, and Ottmar said, okay, I can make this machine work better, but it will never do what you want it to do. And of course, this guy was a bit heartbroken, like, well, what do you mean? Because this is my baby. Right. But Ottmar says, but seeing what you've done, I can take this to the next step and make it better. And now this guy Celphane is intrigued, and that's how he starts, Ottmar does, along the line of inventing the linotype. And when he finally does it, he's now, by this time, he's got, the investors and all this kind of thing. He just toils endlessly. I mean, he's just such a dedicated worker. I mean, this was his whole reason for living, was the invention of this machine. And he was just a tireless worker, an inventor, and he finally invents his machine, and he debuts it in the New York Tribune newspaper printing room in front of Whitelaw Reid, who was the publisher at the time. And he sits down, and Ottmar types some stuff in, and through his machine process, which is detailed in the book, out pops this line of type. In fact, I think it was Reid who actually said, "Oh my God, Ottmar, you've done it! It's a line of type," and that name stuck, the linotype. Right. And so the machine then was, the manufacturing and distribution, and every newspaper in the world wanted it. And of course, it exploded on the publishing industry, not only newspapers, but books as well. And it made Otmar famous beyond words, and it made his family wealthy beyond all imagination. Wow. And but what I always caution here is that this was a family, the Mergenthalers, thanks to Otmar, who were blessed with prosperity, yet cursed by tragedy. And we see that play out again and again and again in this poor family's, journey. And that it starts with Otmar. And, he, for all his success and all his brilliance, he died at the age of 45 from tuberculosis. And he died in 1899. Right. And at the time of his death, in 1899, the family fortune was valued at $43 million. Now, you think about that in terms of that time, a century ago. Oh, my God. So the family was, again, wealthy beyond words. So that's kind of where George, obviously he comes into play because he's Otmar's grandson. But George isn't born until 1920. So, there's a whole 20 years goes by. Mm-hmm. That the family business is thriving and growing and building, and the money's flowing in. And by the time, and again, this is all detailed in the book, because Otmar had 4 sons and a daughter, but by the time George is born in 1920, right, he is then the sole male heir to this fortune. And in the book we describe how all that comes about. And again, there's some very tragic events that happen, and it's well detailed, but that's how George ends up being. Again, this guy who was wealthy beyond words, but so humbled about it. Like, nobody really knew. He didn't tell anybody. Right. Nobody really knew about it. And yes, he was also blessed with movie star good looks, and he was Ivy League educated, and he spoke German and French, and he was just a very generous and wonderful guy. He was just a really nice guy that everybody liked.
That is absolutely incredible. And again, that he just doesn't make a big deal of it, and he just goes about his life. So everything is relatively humming along, but then Pearl Harbor comes along, and again, George's reaction to this, to me, was just absolutely staggering.
Yes, true. And at that time, prior to the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor, again, we have to sort of cast ourselves back to that moment in history where America was not, they didn't want to get involved in a war. And there was a huge anti-war, isolationist movement, throughout the country, and in fact, George's class of 1939 and the following class of 1940 at Princeton University, they had voted Adolf Hitler as the most interesting, person in the world, even over Albert Einstein, who was on the faculty of Princeton University. And the reason behind that wasn't that they really believed it, but it was more just a sort of a statement vote to say, we don't want to get involved in any of this, so like we're not like inciting anything. And so there was that incredible movement at the time that, America didn't want to get involved. Mm-hmm. And prior to this, however, Roosevelt had initiated the Lend-Lease Act with England, because again, at this point, pretty much all of Europe is under the thumb of Nazi rule, and Hitler had trained his sights on Great Britain in the Battle of Britain and all that, and the basic raw materials were sort of depleted in England at the time. So Roosevelt steps in and says, we're going to do the Lend-Lease Act, and starts basically giving them all this war material, everything they could possibly need to stave off a German invasion. But aside from that, that's it. America didn't want to enter the war. Yeah. Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, December 7th, we know, the day that lives in infamy, and George, like so many of his generation, wanted to do their part. They just wanted to do their part, and immediately they go and he enlists in the army against his father's best wishes. Right. His father's very upset about this, but again, he wants to do his part because he sees he was a student of history, and saw what had happened during the First World War. And it was very, obviously knew what was happening in Europe at that time. And again, he still had relatives there. And he sees, what Germany is doing. And so he's probably, more than most of his friends at the time, was very engaged and involved in what was happening. So as soon as the war is declared, he runs off and enlists. But his enlistment is deferred until he graduates. Now, he does graduate in 1943, but on an accelerated program, because at this time the Army needs all the men they can get, and so they're taking anybody. But because he was in school at the time, it was deferred until 1943. He goes into this accelerated program, and in 1943 graduates in January, and literally days later is on his way to Camp Hood in Texas. Remember, at that time it was Camp Hood, not Fort Hood,
right.
And he's on his way to Texas, and that's where he goes in for basic training.
But I just have to, and again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but 1, the family's wealthy. 2, it's very well connected. 3, he's got an education. 4, he can speak languages. I mean, and for him to kind of shun all that, nope, I just want to fight in the Army. I want to be a private. I just want to be a cog in the machine.
Right, and he did, and he just wanted to be one of the guys. And in fact, when he was down in Camp Hood, they had this special program. It was called the STAR program, and it was the special training. And what basically it was is that they had the Army had need for certain non-commissioned men who were trained in medicine, languages. There was very specific areas, and it was called the STAR program. And sort of as a way of appeasing his father, George said, "Okay, I'll look at getting involved in one of these STAR programs." Now it was you had to enroll in it, you had to be interviewed, you had to pass an exam and all this kind of stuff to even be considered for this thing. And oddly enough, what they did is all these men who qualified for the STAR program were then sent to certain universities who were aiding in the war effort in this special training program, of which Princeton was one of them. So It was just it was interesting. He probably would have ended up going back to Princeton. However, he enlists, and in his interview, they find out that he speaks fluent German and French, and they're like, "Oh, hang on a second.
Right.
No, you're not going into the STAR program. We need guys like you in recon.
Right.
That's what we need." So he gets assigned to a recon troop. Now, interestingly, he went and volunteered down in Camp Hood. He wanted to be part of the Tank Destroyer Division, which was this newly created division by the Army, because they were looking, even prior to their entrance into the war, they were trying to come up with a way of stopping the German armor advance through Europe. Because in fairness to the Germans, their battle strategy with using armored divisions was incredible,
right.
And they used it very effectively. And as we see, nobody could stop them. So the U.S. Army was looking at a way of countering that, because if by some chance the U.S. was drawn into war, which obviously they were, they needed to be ready to go with something to counter that German armor attack. Right. So they had created this tank destroyer division, and George had volunteered for that. But George is also very tall,
right?
So it was sort of one of those things where it's going to be a tight fit in these tank destroyer vehicles,
right?
But when they found out that he spoke German and French, it was like, "Oh, no, we got you. You're going on a recon thing." But again, he insisted on being a buck private. He insisted on serving his time as a private, right. Even though he was again he was Ivy League graduated, spoke this fluent German, et cetera, et cetera. So he gets assigned to the 28th Cavalry Recon Troop, a mechanized recon troop. They weren't on horses anymore, right. And they are then attached to the 28th Infantry Division, and so they end up going with this division and training and doing all these things right alongside the rest of the division, and that's kind of where he sort of launches into the war at that point.
Here's a question for you: what would you do to save humanity, and how far would you go to stop someone who is getting in your way? The ancient rivalry of assassins and Templars cuts to the heart of good versus evil, but it wasn't always clear who was good and who was evil. Plug in to explore the amazing world of medieval feuds. Echoes of History, Assassins versus Templars is a special collaboration between History Hit and Ubisoft, the masterminds behind the Assassin's Creed games. Hosted by Dan Snow from History Hit and Matt Lewis from Gone Medieval, together they will take a close look at the real history of the secret societies, which inspired the Assassin's Brotherhood and the Templar Order in the Assassin's Creed games. Plus, they will bring on other premier historians as they discuss unearthing the myths of the Grail and who really was the inspiration for the main characters in the game. Echoes of History, Assassins vs. Templars podcast is available right now wherever you get your podcasts. Listen and subscribe to Echoes of History today to discover the hidden truths that have shaped our world and inspired the video game series. That's Echoes of History, wherever you get your podcasts. Listen today and subscribe for more. That's incredible. So he's just saying, no, I just want to do my part. That's amazing. So he goes through his training, and you can certainly touch on that if you want. But because of the way things worked out with having to finish school and do his training, he's not quite ready to go over when D-Day comes. He's gonna go over, if I remember, a little later after that.
Well, what happened was that being attached to the 28th Infantry Division, the recon troop trained with them. But being a recon troop, they also had to be prepared besides just the normal infantry for certain other types of engagements, close quarter engagements, small arms engagements, town, building to building, in town fighting, that kind of thing. So they also were given specialized training aside from just your basic infantrymen. But again, they were attached to the 28th. So when the 28th Infantry Division shipped out of Boston, I think it was in October of 43, I believe it was. Don't hold me to that one. Right. I think it was October 43. They ship out from Boston, and they end up in Wales to train for additional overseas training in Wales to prepare for the invasion. Now, at the time, everybody knew that there was going to be an invasion. People knew it, and as we've seen through various historical accounts, there was so much deception as to where was it going to happen and who was going to be involved, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of it was very hush hush. So all these divisions went through the kind of the same amphibious assault training, and the 28th Infantry Division was no different. They were training in Wales. For the recon troop, they were in a town called St. Clair's, and so they were kind of spread out all throughout the Wales. And when they were there for probably like 6 or 7 months, just constantly training. An interesting quick sidebar here. Because the 28th Infantry Division was actually the Pennsylvania National Guard, and that was how they came to be. Many of the soldiers in the troop were from the Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio region, which is all mining, right, steel mining country, right? Because that's what was going on at the time. Well, in Wales, coal mining was the thing. So a lot of the Welsh people had emigrated years ago to the U.S. and ended up in places like Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio. So the people in Wales, when the 28th Infantry Division were, basically assigned to them, and they were the towns were overrun by these GIs. More so than probably a lot of places, the Welsh people really sort of embraced the men of the 28th because they're like, hey, these are our people. Yes. I mean, some of these guys were like, some of the guys in 28th actually had relatives in Wales. Wow. And so it was interesting. Like they, more so than any other troops that ended up training there, the Welsh people really embraced the 28th. And when we see that counted in the book a couple of times too. But George is over there training with the rest of the division. And come like May of 1944, they get word now they're going to go to England to marshal for the invasion. Again, it's all hush-hush secret. Nobody really knows where and what divisions are going and all this kind of stuff. And sure enough, come D-Day, June 6, 1944, the 28th is not involved in the initial assault. They're held in reserve because I think we sometimes through the prism of time look back and say, D-Day, oh my gosh, it was what a tremendous invasion and largest amphibious assault at the time and what a success it was. But right up to the time it was happening, Eisenhower didn't know if it was going to work. Right. They didn't know. Yeah. So I mean, a lot of troops were held in reserve just in case. And so the 28th was one of those troops, one of those divisions that was held in reserve. So the whole division didn't actually go into the European theater until a month later, until mid-July. And of course, George, being part of that recon troop, was with the 28th, and so they went in mid-July, and that was the first time they set foot in European soil. And by this time, of course, the Allies had established a foothold and a beachhead and everything, and so they immediately go in, and they're confronted with the hedgerow country of France, and fighting, and at that stage, the early stages here in July, the fighting was for yards of ground versus miles of ground. So they were just struggling to get through this just horrible hedgerow country, and interestingly, that they were not really prepared for that kind of a fight. Even though they went through all this type of training. This bit of reconnaissance, from aerial reconnaissance and such, had not prepared them for the tight quarters and tightness of these thick, just almost impenetrable hedgerows. And so they had to, on the spot, sort of rethink their whole strategy in fighting through this country. For instance, and I was funny because I talked to several veterans of the recon troop, 28th Cavalry Recon Troop, and they all said the same thing. Is like a lot of times what you would do is you would go and you would the way their job, their main focus wasn't so much to engage the enemy, but it was more to just find out where the enemy was, report back to headquarters, and then based on what their information was, the commanders would then sort of reconfigure their battle plans based on, again, what information was coming back from the front, from band scouts. Well, what happened was the way sometimes, especially in the Bocage regions, the hedgerow country, the only way they could find out where the enemy positions was by going in and waiting till they started shooting at you, and that's it. And it's
that works.
And it's like it's very hazardous, but literally they're driving along, and as soon as the enemy opens up, they'd stop, pull back, and then they'd radio in and say, okay, here's your map coordinates, a grid section, and here's where they are, and then they would do that. But the Germans started getting wise to that, so what they would end up doing was they would allow the recon troop, the advance scouts, to pass right by and wait for the larger column of infantry to come by. So it was really very much a chess match going on there, and so it was very and I know I'm getting bogged down in the details here, but it's important to understand all of this as we move forward in the story, because it explains how this division, this entire division, and the recon troop becomes so battle hardened so quickly.
Yeah, so it's a good thing they had all that training, even though they do have to change things up. Like you said, the Germans are far from beaten or broken at this point, so they certainly have to keep fighting in order, one, to keep moving forward, but two, to survive. So they have their action, they see action. But if I remember, the 28th group, the recon group, does pretty well as far as, if I'm remembering correctly, as far as not sustaining too many casualties before they end up in a small town in Luxembourg.
Yeah, they were lucky, if you can use the term. Like of course, they did sustain some losses, but it wasn't. If you think about literally the front, the point scouts and the dangers they encounter, they actually didn't encounter too many casualties. They were in the Hürtgen Forest. And the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest was this horrific battle. And it started in late September 1944, and by November, which is when the 28th Infantry Division was committed to this battle, and that included the recon troop. They went in like the first couple of weeks of November. Now, if you think about it, there's like a 50 square mile patch of forest on the German-Belgian border that the Americans, this is strictly an American fight, by the way, that the American command thought they needed to capture because they were afraid of the Germans blowing up the dams on the Roar River Valley and flooding the valley. And they were thinking that if that happened, that would delay the entrance into Germany and just create more logistical problems. So this battle, this Hurtgen Forest battle, and the troops that were committed there were sort of on the flank of this to make sure that they could control this area, and also the American High Command considered the Hurtgen Forest a staging area for the Germans. They were trying to prevent the Germans from using this to assemble troops to perhaps counterattack advancing American troops on the flank. So this was sort of the role of this army to go in on the flanking side and to take this forest. Beginning of November the 28th is entered into this Hurtgen Forest battle, and Ray, I have to tell you, it was devastating. I mean, if you think about the troop strength and of a division, and there's like 9,000, 10,000 guys in a division, that in just 2 weeks fighting time, 2/3 of the division became casualties of this one battle. So 6,000 guys were casualties of this one battle, wounded or dead. So it was just, the 28th was just decimated in this, and again they were 2 weeks in there, and what was happening is the U.S. Army was just rotating in these different divisions. So the 28th came in to relieve the 9th Division, and so. It was horrible. The recon troop, what their assignment was, is they were up on a ridge overlooking one of the dams on the Kahl River, and again, it was the fear was that the Germans might blow the dam, and et cetera, and they were also there to be a conduit of communication between a couple of different regiments at the time, and they were also there to direct artillery fire. So they were not necessarily in the front line fighting, but at one point the artillery shells were falling so fast and so frequently that, as the veterans told me, they weren't sure if they were German or American shells coming down. They just didn't know. And this was constant. And even just to get to their position, the roads were heavily mined. All the I should say the roads, the paths, because there really were no roads. What roads there were thick with mud, so there was no vehicles, there's no armor support or anything like that. And the weather conditions were terrible, so there was no air support from the Army Air Corps. So really, this was an infantryman's battle. I mean, this was like all infantry, and so luckily, and I say that word, I mean, if you want to call it luck, the recon troop, although they were part of this battle, were in a position where they were enough removed from the frontline fighting that really what they had to worry about was mines and artillery, and that's the kind of thing. So for 2 weeks they sat there in forward position, being the eyes and ears of the artillery, and it really wasn't until kind of as they were getting ready to leave that they sustained their first casualties in that battle, and it happened because they it was so pitch black at night that and they had. They had taken control of these pillboxes that the Germans had built while they controlled the area. But the only way to access these was from this road that you couldn't really see. So the protocol was for the guys who were holding these pillboxes to walk down the road and to meet the oncoming replacements, and then guide them up to the pillboxes. And when doing so, one of the vehicles ran over a mine that happened to be on this small narrow road, and it was an M8 Greyhound that ran over this mine, and the Greyhounds were these scout vehicles which had very thin armor plating on the bottom, and they were no match for the German mines, and so. That's when they basically had their first real casualties of that particular battle. And that was when they were being rotated out, and they were being sent to the rear for R&R, and again to sort of regroup, resupply, and to get more men. And that was the entire division was sent west into Luxembourg for R&R, and they ended up, the recon troop being sent to this small little farming town called Eschweiler. And that's where the recon troop was.
That's incredible. Now, before we move on, because I'm trying to remember from your book, correct me if I'm wrong, so you've got these 6,000 casualties, but the great irony was, if I remember correctly, the Germans weren't going to do what the Americans thought they were going to do, which is why they launched attack after attack when it came to the dams. Is that
You're
correct?
absolutely right. You're absolutely right. In fact, it turned out, hindsight being 2020, of course, but it turned out to be one of a battle that was completely unnecessary because the Germans had no intention of of flooding the river valley or anything like that. And yeah, maybe they were thinking of yes, they could use the forest as a way of gathering troops, but the Germans, and we found out after the war, from veterans who fought there, couldn't understand why the Americans kept attacking there, because it was like that was not their main focus.
Yeah.
That was strictly part of the Siegfried Line, and the Germans were just there to defend it. They were not. There was no real plan for them to do anything but that. So it really confused them as to why the American soldiers were constantly attacking, and sustaining such heavy casualties. As a result, I mean, don't forget that because it was this sort of steep ravine valley in the Hurtgen Forest and everything, the Germans controlled all the high ground. So the Americans, along with all the other obstacles that they were fighting, like the entire area being pre-sighted for mortars and artillery and spools of barbed wire and mines and all this other stuff. They were fighting an uphill battle, into heavily machine gun territory. So it was just the worst possible conditions for a battle you could ever have. And again, it was so devastating that the Germans nicknamed the 28th Infantry the Bloody Bucket Division because of their shoulder patch with red keystone of Pennsylvania, which looked to the Germans like buckets of blood. And it was just they sort of gave him that nickname just because it was the losses were just so incredible. It was absolutely mind-boggling, and you're absolutely right. As it turns out, was a completely unnecessary battle in the long run.
Yeah, as we find out, wars hardly ever go the way they're planned. You make your plans, the war starts, and then you ad lib from then on out. So the 28th...
They're very fluid, yeah.
Exactly. So the 28th Reconnaissance Group is there in Eschweiler. They got some downtime. And like you were saying before, this is not a very big place. And I just picture when I was getting to this part of your book, I just imagine the people there, they've been through, 4 or whatever years of German occupation. Now these American troops are coming. I wonder if there was some intrepidation as they see these GIs pulling up, because to them, they're just more guys in uniform.
They couldn't have been happier.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, and this is detailed in the book as well. The struggles that the Luxembourg people suffered under Nazi rule, and it was truly a horribly oppressive time. Again, almost 5 years of Nazi rule,
right?
And the Luxembourg people. You have to remember, the Germans looked at Luxembourg as part of Germany, and they considered they were annexing them and they were welcoming them back to the fatherland. And the Luxembourg people are very proud people, and they were like, we're Luxembourgers, and very proud of it. And so they resisted as much as they could. But again, it was such a terrible time for the people there. And they couldn't, and they were liberated on September 10th, 1944, and they could not have been happier to see the U.S. soldiers come in, and they welcomed them with open arms, and yeah, they were liberators. They were happy to see them there. So when the 28th Recon Troop came in on November 16th, 1944, to Eschweiler, they were welcomed by the people of the town. In fact, for the next month, the people in Eschweiler, shared their homes. Again, not that they had any choice. And don't get me wrong, because the military comes in and they say, okay, we're gonna set up guys in this house and that house and and here and there, because they need places to bivouac these guys. And so the people in the town had to share their homes, but also, both the Luxembourg people in Eschweiler and the Americans shared their meals and their downtime, and they became very friendly with the people in Eschweiler. And George, in particular, because he could speak German, which everybody in Luxembourg spoke, and French, which many people in Luxembourg speak, he was able more than anybody else in that troop to communicate with everybody. And so the people in Eschweiler sort of in a way, adopted George as like one of their own. I mean, they really embraced him as being like one of their own, and so much so that the local priest, his name is Father Bodson, offered George a room at the parsonage. He had a spare room at the parsonage, and George was very religious. Was a Catholic, very religious, and attended mass every day, and was more than happy to take the priest up on the offer, with the condition. And again, this just goes to show the spirit of George Mergenthaler, with the condition that if there was also room for his best friend Cletus and Cletus Lafond, and so the priest said, yes, it's a small room, but there should be enough room for the both of you, and so he says, great, we'll take it. So he George and his best friend Cletus end up staying at the parsonage for a couple of weeks during this time of R&R. And it was a case of the people in Eschweiler opening their hearts and their homes and their hearts to the soldiers, because they looked at the soldiers as liberators, and in this particular recon troop, they really endeared themselves to the people of Eschweiler in the month that they stayed there, and they would help with the chores around the town. Wow. And again, this is a small town, but it's a farming village, is what it was. Mm-hmm. Dairy farms and things like that. So, and again, as it's detailed in the book, there weren't a lot of men around at the time because of the German occupation. Yeah. Because any male of military age was either forced to serve in the German army, or had gone into hiding, or if they refused both, were end up at some labor camp or worse. Yeah. And so the men weren't really around. They were just young boys and teenage boys at the time. So when it came to chop wood or whatever, the GIs were more than happy to lend a hand, and sort of in a way, it was also for the GIs, it was a break from the war. Yes, they still had their daily assignments of reconnaissance and mm-hmm. and guard duty at night and things like that, because don't forget that they weren't that far removed from the frontline fighting. Right. But nowhere near as bad as it was in the Hurgan Forest. So this was easy. This was downtime, and so when they weren't doing those daily army duties, they were either hanging out or helping the people in town, and they loved it, because it was a sort of a sense of normalcy in is otherwise the chaos of war.
Right, and I have to say real quick that this was one of my favorite parts of the book, because here's George and here's the rest of the 28th Reconnaissance Group. I think it's around 60 men. I think that number is close. Yep. But George's George's millions of dollars doesn't matter. His Ivy League education doesn't matter, because he's in this place. They have no idea who he is. But he comes in, he's nice, he's helpful, he's humble, he speaks the language, he's getting along with the priests. And no matter your opinion or attitude about faith, this guy truly was a believer, and I think that came across. And he just impressed them with the quality of person that he was versus the riches that he had access to, and he was the sole heir. I just think that the quality of who he was just impressed these simple farming people, and they, like you said, they took to him and they adopted him.
No, you nailed it. You absolutely nailed it. The only person who knew that he came from wealth was his best friend Cletus. And I don't even think Cletus knew.
Really knew. Yeah.
Really knew the depth
How
and
many
breadth
millions?
Of his. Yeah, right. Yeah, I don't think even Cletus knew, but Cletus knew. George had shared a lot of his story with him. Right. It's family history as well. But the rest of the recon troop, the only thing they really knew was that George came from money. That's it. That's all they knew. They knew he was Ivy League educated, right? And that was it. And and if you go back to step back in time to their training in Wales, George was actually tapped to teach German, like simple phrases and things like that the Army thought officers would need as they went into the after the invasion. He was tapped to teach courses, to teach classes, mm-hmm. Pennycode Mansion, which is just outside of St. Clair's, where they were stationed, and so everybody knew this guy was smart and all this kind of stuff, but he was very humble about it. He would just do what he was asked, and that was it. It was not a big thing, and he was, as you say, by the time they get to Eschweiler, the guys in the troop he was just one of the guys. It was no big deal.
Right.
And people in the town, they embraced George because, yes, he could communicate with them, but he was just so charismatic, such a nice guy, shared everything that he had.
Yes.
He kept getting these care packages from home, and in fairness, he would often write home and ask his mom and dad to send him certain things that he knew the people in Luxembourg and other people that he has encountered along the way through France and Belgium, etc. Right. He knew what they were lacking, the things they didn't have, and so he was always asking his parents, send this, send this, and this. And his father, through his connections, was always able to sort of fast track delivery of things. And so like for instance, one of the big events that happens at that time in Luxembourg is the celebration of St. Nicholas Day, mm-hmm. and it happens just after Thanksgiving. So the actual day is December 6th. And George, like the rest of the troop, find out that because of the Nazi occupation, the people in Luxembourg weren't able to celebrate St. Nicholas Day because it was a holiday that was forbidden for them to celebrate because it was not a sanctioned German holiday. God only knows why, but it wasn't. So they were not able to celebrate it. And St. Nicholas Day, as opposed to Christmas, is sort of a town-wide event versus Christmas, which is more family. Yeah. So, here after nearly 5 years of Nazi occupation, they are able to celebrate St. Nicholas Day, but because of the ravages of war, they didn't really have anything to celebrate with. And George was like, "Oh no, we can't let that happen." So he asks anybody who's got like a 3-day pass to Clairvaux or to Paris, whatever. He basically sends them out with a shopping list and money and says, buy things, and so they come back with stuff, and he's writing his folks and send things like this. So come St. Nicholas Day, he wanted to make sure that, especially for the children, they all had something to to celebrate the holiday with. So again, he was just I can't say this enough, and I don't want to bore everybody, but he really was just an incredibly generous person, generous of spirit, generous in his manner, and that's just who he was. And yes, he had money, but that allowed him to again help those who really didn't have anything. And his gestures, some of them weren't that big. Like one of the guys he knew in town or befriended in town, believe it or not, one of the things that were hard to come by were razor blades. Mm-hmm. I mean, they just didn't have any. So he goes to the quartermaster and makes a deal to get razor blades, and he gets razor blades for this guy. It was just little simple things like that. Right. He knew that the priest had taken up photography, like before the war started. And because of the war, he didn't have any film, so he makes another deal with somebody in the Signal Corps to get some film for the priest's camera. So he just he was just so selfless in his thinking. Like it wasn't like somebody would say something and he would just let it go. He would think of like, okay, how can I help that? How can I do something for that? Oh wow, and so he was just that kind of a spirit, just a very caring, generous soul, and as I wrote the book, and it sounds really weird, but I think you'll know what I mean. As the more I got to know George, mm-hmm. through people I've talked to, through all the documentation I have, he was just such an incredible soul, and it was just I say that I don't say this lightly. It's a pleasure knowing him. So there you go.
Well, that's what makes the end so much more poignant, and it makes you want to be a better person yourself. And before we go on, I do have to say real quick, when I went to your website, mm-hmm. I looked, and you can see at the top of the website, you can see the little short film about Saint Nick coming in on the back of the Jeep. About your other book, American Saint Nick. Right. You could just see the kids standing around going, "This is wonderful, but it's been so crappy for the last 4 or 5 years. I don't know if I should show joy." You just see the mixed emotions on their face. They're like, "Yay!" but I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be happy. Right. So that's what that reminded me of. It's like when he starts doing these little things for people, it's like it reminds them that civilization is coming back to your village, and that was just I just enjoyed that part a lot.
No, you're absolutely right, and that's was part of it too. It's like he and the rest of these soldiers were able to remind everybody that humanity was still there. I mean, these were people. They weren't just like the vanquished, or they weren't like they were people, and they knew that, and I think as much as the town of Eschweiler embraced these soldiers, the soldiers also became friendly with them. I mean, again, they were there living amongst these people for a month. Straight, and there was a bond there that as we know exists to this day.
Yeah, that is incredible. So the 28th Reconnaissance Group is there. They're there for a month. They do develop this bond, which of course has many different parts to it, like you said. But then the pleasantness it does come to an end.
Right, and in the harshest of ways, December 16th, literally a month, from when they arrived, the Battle of the Bulge erupts, and it's the German surprise attack through the Ardennes, and Eschweiler and Luxembourg they're at the forefront of it. They are the Ardennes, so this is where the Germans are crashing through the porous American lines, and the porous lines are there because who's defending, like who's on the front line defending this, but the 28th Infantry Division that has just been decimated in this battle. And in some areas of this line, don't forget, this was sort of like, I think it was a 50-mile front that they were trying to protect, or at least, were defending, on guard, whatever you want to call it. That they were spread so thin that literally there were parts that the Germans could come right through, and there was no resistance at all. And the Germans knew this, and they took advantage of that, and they poured through these thinly defended lines, and it allowed the Battle of the Bulge to begin. The 28th, in fairness, put up a tenacious fight to defend and to hold them back as much as they could, and certainly in the northern shoulder they were able to do that to some degree, but in the southern end of the line, the Germans came right through, and that's where we get that bulge from, because of course the bulge was named after the bulge in the lines that pushed all the way into Belgium, and we know stone and everything. Interestingly enough, the orders as the battle was raging for 1 or 2 days, the orders came for the 28th to pull back, and they were told to pull back to Bastogne. If all we know now, it's like, oh wow, of all the places they could have gone back to, they were told to go to Bastogne. They never got there because as they were falling back, the Germans were advancing to the point where they said, we got to keep going, and they kept falling back further and further and further. Yes. But what ends up happening in this particular town of Eschweiler is that the Germans are advancing, and the town by December 18th is pretty much surrounded. They're surrounded on three sides by the advancing Germans, and again, the 60 guys in the recon troop are doing their best to hold off the advancing Germans as much as they can. What helped them, I think, was the weather had turned it was starting to turn nasty. Right. Up to this point, it was we see the Battle of the Bulge, we see the heavy snows and everything, and those snows did come, but they came a few days later. In the early stages of the Bulge, the 16th, December 16th, December 17th, etc. It hadn't really been that bad. It was a bit overcast and rainy and things like that. At some points, even the sun came out. But by December 18th, the weather started to turn, and a bit of snow started falling. And so I think what was helping the recon troop defend the town was, number one, it was open terrain because of the farmlands. So the German infantry without the armor support really couldn't make that advance on the town without being torn up. But also because the weather hadn't really turned yet, we were able to see, they were able to see the soldiers. So by December 18th, there's been this string of refugees coming through the town. They know that the Germans are advancing. They know that they're not going to be stopped. Despite the best efforts, the recon troop is forced to pull out of Eschweiler. And so they very quickly put together this convoy. I think it was like 6 vehicles, and they head out of town. And there's, again, I mentioned earlier, there was one road in, and you go out the other end of town. It was kind of the same way. Right. And so they were trying to decide which way would be best. Well, a round of, a volley of artillery convinced them, well, we only have one way. Let's head south.
Right.
and their orders were to head south anyway, to try to reinforce the withdrawal of the headquarters division from Wiltz, which was again 4 miles away. So they're ordered to head south, and they do, and the road is a bit winding, and it's open, and it's muddy, and again there's the snow starting to fall, and it's kind of treacherous. But they make it, and they go about a mile down the road, and they take a turn in the road where it's sort of lined with trees on either side. And as they get into that turn, and they start heading down that little I call it almost like an alleyway, they drive basically into the spearhead of the German advance in that sector, and it's like they have nowhere to go. They're ambushed. They pull to the side of the road. Right. The Germans who are coming up from the ridge open fire, and these guys, they tumble out of their vehicles. I mean, it happened so quickly. Most of the guys, dove for cover, forgetting their weapons. I mean, their weapons were still in the jeeps and in their transport vehicles, and so they're basically pinned down because they couldn't back up because the Germans disabled the last vehicle. They couldn't go forward because there was a tank in the middle of the road, and the Germans on the left were advancing up the hill, and on the right, the recon troop would have had to run uphill over some open terrain before hitting the cover of woods, which would expose them to enemy fire. So they were literally pinned down, nowhere to go, nowhere to run, and really at this point, it's either death or capture. That's it. There were no options until George jumped up and said, I can't, this can't happen. And he jumps up.
Yeah.
And in the command Jeep, which is where he was, there was a 50 caliber machine gun mounted in the Jeep. He jumps up, and again, the Germans are firing. I mean, they're in the middle of firefight. He jumps up, pulls the action and just starts pumping machine gun fire into the woods where the Germans are shooting from, to try to lay down enough suppressing fire to let everybody else escape. And so as he's doing this, he's yelling to these guys, "Go, go, go!" And they do. They make a run for it, and they start heading out. And even though they're running, they can still hear the bullets flying overhead from the Germans who are trying to get shots off. And just then the machine gun jams. Oh. And George is he's trying to clear it out, and bullets are hissing all around him. Right. And there's this one soldier's crawling up this culvert, and he rears up and tries opens fire, and his one of the guys in the troops sees this and returns fire and basically strikes this German and kind of knocks him down. Right. Buying George enough time to clear the jam, which he does, and he reloads it, and he re-racks the action, and he starts firing again, and he basically tells everybody, go, make a run for it, get out of here.
Can I just say real quick, I just have to be honest with you and say, one, there's a part of me that's tempted to stop the interview now just to drive people crazy. Because when I got to this part of the book, I literally, my wife, we were sitting in the living room, I put the book down and went, oh my God, the gun's jammed. And she's like, what are you talking about? So I'm like, I was just so tense. And then okay, I can read this. So anyway, I just had to say, I just had to share that with you because it was like a horror movie or whatever, except for it's true. And I'm on pins and needles at this point.
Well, maybe that is a good point for us to stop it.
We might get hate mail. We might get hate mail if we stop.
Well, so George, he's in the Jeep. He clears the breach, reloads it, racks the action, and he's firing and tells these guys, make a run for it, whatever. And he starts, again, laying down suppressing fire, and he's doing this as much as he can. And then another volley of bullets comes his way, and he's struck. And he gets knocked down, and some of the guys see this happen, but of course they can't do anything about it, and they all take off. What an interesting side note here is that of all the soldiers that made a run for it that day, I believe, and I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but I think it was about a dozen actually make it back to the Allied lines. The rest are captured and sent to POW camps. But interestingly, they all survived the war. Wow. So, if we look at it, it was George's actions that day that allowed
Yes.
that basically there are families in existence today that owe their existence to the actions of George Mergenthaler that one day, because all these guys survived. They survived the war. They went home. They raised families, and had he not done that, I don't know if that would have been the case. I mean, there's no way for us to know, but it would know the case. So, and then of course the snows come. The snows of the Bulge come, and it was the worst winter in that region in like 50 years. And so what happens is that nobody knows what happens to George. The people in the recon troop don't know. His parents don't know. He's listed as missing in action. Nobody knows what happens to him until March of 1945. The snows are beginning to melt, and it's actually some townspeople that discover his body. And they see what calls their attention is that there's a girl. She's walking up the road to the town, and she finds these photographs on the side of the road, and she recognizes them because George had shown them to her. He showed them to everybody because he was sharing with his family photos.
Right.
And she looks up, and just off in the distance, she sees a helmet on a crudely constructed stone grave. And she puts two and two together in her head, and runs up to the priest and tells the priest what she sees. And of course, the priest comes down, and that while they were in Eschweiler, one of the care packages that George had received was a Christmas present from his mother, and his mother had made him this purple sweater. This bright purple sweater that he wore under his army uniform, because it wasn't the official dress, the OD. So he wore it under, and when the priest discovers the body, that's basically how he's positively identified, is by that purple sweater.
Right.
So they identify the body, and the townspeople come and they disinter George, and they bring him to the town cemetery, which is across from the church, and they bury him in the town cemetery. And it's a great honor for them to do for this to happen. And they place him in a place where he overlooks the fields where he had spent a lot of his time while he was there. And then the priest writes home to his parents, and that's when his parents discover that George had died. But the priest also tells them of what a great person their son was, how much he meant to the town, how much the priest himself was taken by George, and that they considered each other brothers, because they had that kind of a relationship that had developed in the months they're there. They had so many things in common. And the parents, though devastated and heartbroken, again, this was their only child. This was their only son, only child. They're devastated, and so even so, they wanted to do something to show their appreciation for the town that embraced their son. So they offered to help the funding of the rebuilding of the church. And so they contact architects, and they get people, and this is after the war. Despite the whole Marshall Plan, they're like, no, we're gonna rebuild the church. Yeah, pretty much we got this. and they fund the rebuilding of the church, and it was the priest, Father Bodson, who sort of was directing all this, and they rebuilt it basically stone by stone, brick by brick, exactly how it had been. They had to get a new organ, and they had to get new stained glass windows, which he commissioned the designing of, and they even commissioned the painting, the hand painting of the mural behind the altar, and the mural shows Jesus feeding the masses with the help of an apostle, and the apostle is dressed in army uniform and bears the likeness of George Mergenthaler, and that's what you see when you walk in the church to this day, and it grabs your heart.
It does. Oh my God. Yeah, because when I got to that part, you start flipping through the book. Okay, I know the photos in here. I got to see it, and you're right. It was absolutely amazing, and no matter your religious beliefs or whatever, it seems to capture the caring that George was about, certainly in that village and probably his entire life. But that was the most beautiful tribute I think I've ever seen to anyone.
Yeah, I have to agree. It's stunning. And as I say, it's the only church in the world, as far as anyone knows, dedicated to a single American soldier. And that's George Mergenthaler.
Yeah. So this is an incredible story. And yes, listeners, we have left things out that you'll find out in the book. It's definitely worth it. The book, I believe Merg comes out on April 1st, but you can order it now. But Mr. Lyon, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for sharing the story, even though you've had it with you for 20 years. I'm glad you finally got around to it. The story is Merg, the true story of one World War II soldier's selfless act of valor that one town never forgot. Mr. Lyon, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Ray. Appreciate it.